Hello and welcome to another episode of Talking Tropes. I'm Pride.
And I'm Prejudice.
And I'm Zombies.
We are taking a trip back to Regency era Great Britain to talk about the works of Jane Austen and their more recent
With
modernization and film adaptations.
And we're doing it all with a very special guest. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Liz. I'm a friend of Hannah's from college, and I'm a pretty big Jane Austen fan.
I mean, yeah, like when we were prepping for this episode, we were like, oh, Liz, maybe watch this and watch that. Liz went above and beyond with the watch list and also reread at least one of the books.
I mean, to be fair, I've already seen most of the watch list.
But you had to go back for another dip.
I mean, that wasn't a problem for me.
Yeah.
So Liz, I wanted to, bring you on. You have a more familiarity with the text, the original text than I do, certainly. I think that like some of the main thematic questions that we're trying to answer by looking at Jane Austen and modern film adaptations of Jane Austen is to sort of say, how does Hollywood tackle these like Regency era values? What are, what kinds of feminisms of the 19th century are sort of twisted and skewed and transformed by their contextualization in modern Hollywood cinema, or BBC cinema, if the case may be.
Well, I think a really interesting thing that Hollywood and the BBC and everything do with Jane Austen, particularly with modern adaptations, is really focus on the romance and make it a romantic comedy, when really Jane Austen, she writes social comedies or comedies and manners. And actually not all of them are particularly funny. I was telling Hannah earlier that rewatching it, Sense and Sensibility is an incredibly sad story, even if it has a happy ending.
Right. Like, and I think it's certainly of note that the happy ending, which most Austen novels, at least the early ones, have, the happy ending is marriage. It simply must be. There's no other
well, there was nothing else that this woman could do that could secure their future, with the exception of Emma.
Right. And it's rarely even an odd marriage or like a couple that isn't sort of like the ideal, husband for, this character as set up in the beginning. So like, let's go through some of the sort of happy couple, happy endings in these books. So we could start with Sense and Sensibilities, since that was one of her first publications. Was it her first novel?
Yeah, it was her first published novel.
Right.
So yeah, this one I wasn't as familiar with when like we went to watch it. And I haven't, full disclosure, I'm very bad. I haven't read any of these. So like, Liz, you are our book expert.
I haven't read Sense and Sensibility in years. So I love the movie version of Sense and Sensibility. I think it's the best Austen adaptation by far.
That's the one directed by and starring Emma Thompson.
Actually, it was
90s.
Directed by Ong Lee.
Yes.
I really hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
It was written by Emma Thompson. You're right. That was
actually, Emma Thompson wasn't going to be the main character.
Oh.
She wrote it. And then the studio was like, "Come on, you gotta be Eleanor Dashwood."
Yeah.
And Eleanor Dashwood is actually really 19 in the original novel, and Marianne is 16. So they just aged everyone up so that Marianne's 19 and Eleanor is 28 or so. Also, it makes it a little less weird with the Colonel Brandon stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So that's another one of these sort of, thematic parts of these stories that doesn't like adapt well if you're trying to like modernize them. So
Right.
ages are something that definitely get shifted around for Hollywood sensibilities, pun
so to
intended.
speak. Yeah, so for those who don't know, like I guess a short recap of what Sense and Sensibility is it's like it's a mother and her 3 poor daughters who basically lose their inheritance to like a stepbrother.
Not exact. Well, sort of. Okay, so so Mr. Dashwood, the father who dies, had a family, and his wife died, and then he remarried.
Right.
And so Eleanor and Marianne are part of his second family.
Right.
There's a big explanation for why John gets all the money. Like,
it's a plot contrivance,
Yeah.
even in the book.
So the father dies unexpectedly. So he begs his son to make sure that his half sisters and his stepmom are taken care of.
Right.
And on his deathbed, but eventually John is talked out of it pretty easily by his wife. So these women who were wealthy now have only 500 pounds a year. I don't know how much that translates to.
Right.
Not
It's
a lot.
basically this story it's to create a ticking clock, basically. Not
Right.
that was really a term of art for fiction writers at that time, but it's to say, okay, no longer do we have, this family is growing up in the aristocracy, in these, prized families, but now, while still retaining their status, they have lost their material wealth and need to marry up in order to maintain the honor of their families, right?
Well,
or just survive.
It's honestly not about honor. It's about having enough money to live.
Well, you say that, but there's a sense of like what would be a marriage that would preserve like the sanctity of the family. I guess that's more so in Pride and Prejudice, but
yeah, that's more of a.
But I mean,
we'll get to that.
But I think that is a common thread in that, they grew up as ladies, they were landed, or grew up in a landed family. So like it feels socially appropriate for them to marry someone else with some kind of distinction like that. Like they would be marrying down if they married like a tradesman or something like that, right?
The thing with Sensibility is that so if Eleanor and Edward, Edward's incredibly wealthy.
Right.
Well, he's not wealthy yet. He's gonna get a bunch of money, but his mother lords that over his head and like declares he can't marry like below his status, essentially. But he falls in love with Eleanor anyway because he's
because he likes her.
He likes her.
And it's romantic.
Yeah.
Right. But like for her to marry, like, the reason she can't just find like the richest merchant in town and be like, marry me.
Exactly.
Is like, it's because of status.
Yeah. It will class.
Right.
Yeah.
Like class. Yeah.
Right. It's all taking place in this, strange period of like a huge burgeoning middle class, huge expansion of women's literacy, the printing press, like the novel existing at all is, dependent on all of these social changes. And so those are all being reflected in the novels themselves. So like for Sense and Sensibility in particular, obviously, like, yeah, the question of like, why is it that women, cannot inherit, land, in this way, why that they, having no other options for, securing their own wealth other than marriage, that when you take away simply like taking away some of their wealth, even though they somehow retain similar status, they can't then marry at the level that they were planning to. And why should that be? And so I think it's a lot of Austen questioning those aspects, but also it still sort of reifies the aristocracy as something that like should exist, that's important to
Mhm.
the nobility of the nation, to propriety, basically.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
it's all about propriety.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And I think like that's always a challenge for modern adaptations to have to deal with, is because the social norms of Regency era Britain are not the same as the social norms of the 90s.
Oh man, isn't that the truth?
Like there are some things that definitely carry over, but the idea of marrying beneath you is less of a thing now than it was
Or
But
it just has
honestly,
taken on a totally
or-
different valence, and I think
Sure.
unless you have a more to say about Sense and Sensibility in particular.
Mhm.
well, I just want to say, because I don't think Sensibility's biggest theme
Mhm.
is Eleanor's sense
Mhm.
versus Marianne's romantic sensibilities.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Not to quote the title or anything.
Yeah.
But because Marianne like is very romantic, and
Mhm.
she's like, she doesn't see how Colonel Brandon could be a good husband because A, he's older, and B, he's not like the romantic hero of her stories.
Right.
Whereas Eleanor does not believe there's any chance that Edward could ever marry her
Mhm.
because of her status, and then later because she learns that he's already
Secretly
engaged
engaged.
to Lucy Steele.
Was that true though? That
Yeah.
he was secret? Oh, okay. I did not realize that was true.
Well, there was a genre of fiction that sort of predated Austen, which were called novels of sensibility or novels of sentimentality,
Mhm.
which were some of like England's first novels. So like Pamela by Samuel Richardson, which was, it also goes by the title Virtue Rewarded. So like it's these tales of like virtuous women who go through many trials and then emerge and have the happy ending marriage.
With a marriage.
And they were very sentimental, very
Right.
not about like the real struggles of people living at that time.
Right,
And so
like-
Austen is in a sense commenting on those in a way that historians sometimes have framed as like she's directly critical, but other times have been like, no, she's just sort of contributing her own like lived reality
Right.
to the more sentimental portrayals in the previous takes, which I think relates directly to what she's become now. As you said, Liz, like now Austen is most associated with the rom-com, the romantic comedy. And so I think a lot of her adaptations into romantic comedy film are sort of commenting on other romantic comedies. And you can see that, I think, in Clueless and in Bridget Jones's Diary. What do you think of that as a take?
No, I agree. Like, if we the 3 movies we watched, which was Bridget Jones' Diary, Clueless, and From Prada to Nada, which I have
that one's a little more obscure
about. They all seem from Prada to Nada's credit, I do think they tried to do a lot with their material.
Yeah.
Especially like the whole like rediscovering your Mexican roots,
Right.
which I thought was a really interesting way of doing that story.
Mhm.
But otherwise, yes, they're all pretty much romantic comedies or a teen drama, or in the case of Clueless.
But even that's like a teen rom-com.
Basically.
Right. But I just mean, in a sense, they're also sort of meta commentaries on other entries in the genre. They're sort of saying we're presenting a more complicated or nuanced protagonist. Alicia Silverstone's character in Clueless, for example, being not quite as likable as many of her, I mean, I still think the character is very likable, but she has like more flaws than a lot of the other romantic leads, the Meg Ryan types of that era.
Right, but
or
it
Winona
also
Ryder
makes
types.
makes her, I think, at least in Clueless, like a more compelling character because she sees a lot more like growth than like some of these other Austen protagonists.
Right.
Well, I would say that Bridget Jones's Diary is a direct like attack on the common romantic comedy.
Yes.
Because she's a mess.
Right.
She's drinks too much.
Yeah.
She smokes. She dates men that aren't good for her.
Right.
A whole bunch of other stuff. Yeah.
And in that sense, I think it captures sort of what's essential maybe about Austen, which is that, people related to her protagonists because they were, they had interesting things to say and they had interesting thoughts and they didn't always mesh perfectly well with their settings. They often felt out of place. And I think people sympathized with that at the time and still do today.
Right. I think, everyone always sees themselves in a lot of ways as an underdog or, maybe if not an outcast, maybe just like, oh, I'm not really the main character, and like that's what a lot of these people say. They're like, oh, well, of course it's my sister Jane who's the beautiful one, and like, I'm just quirky old me, but it's like, yeah, but you're quirky in like a smart way, like that's the whole vibe of like Elizabeth Bennet, and like that's what I think is very interesting about Bridget Jones's Diary specifically, is that I would say her character is the least like in like actual details, the least like the character that she's based off of. She's almost like an amalgamation of like all 5 of the sisters like into one
she
person.
Absolutely is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she's doesn't have any sisters in Bridget Jones.
Yeah.
It's just her mother and her father.
Yeah.
Right. Pride and Prejudice also has that same, it's more of a ticking clock in that one, I suppose, that if they don't marry out of out of their station, the family will, be it will pass to a cousin in this case. So none of them are going to inherit any form of wealth or land. And the house is sort of in danger. But that's not the case in Bridget Jones. It's just simply she would like to marry somebody with a lot of money.
Actually,
does the lack of...
I don't think it's money. I think she just wants to marry someone.
Right. Like she's just like, oh, I don't want to end up an old spinster, like
there's that whole scene where she goes to dinner with all those couples and they're all just like staring at her and being like, why are there so many single people around, Bridget?
And she's like, I don't fucking know. It's not, why would I know that? Like, do I want to be single? No. Am I? I guess so. So I think, in the Pride and Prejudice adaptation, it's almost less about the main character's fidelity and about, like Bridget learning to, be less like prejudiced, and it's almost more about the mystery and the draw and the aura of the Darcy character.
Right.
And I think
who's the only character whose name is directly taken from the book and who's closest, I think, to his novel counterpart. Definitely more so than the Hugh Grant character.
Yes.
Is just sort of an amalgamation of what were those characters' names, Liz?
Wickham and Collins and
Mr. Darcy.
Well, Darcy is Darcy, but yeah.
But he's just sort of a romantic rival for Darcy.
I thought that was a really interesting choice because while Elizabeth Bennet really likes Mr. Wickham in the beginning, particularly because she can bitch about Darcy all the time.
Yeah.
She realizes pretty quickly that she's not actually in love with him. Even though she's like, oh, he's just a friend. Like, she pretty quickly realizes that he is not romantic material in any way whatsoever.
Right, but that's because he gets to be used as this, somebody for one of her sisters to go after, and then, oh no, she's going to ruin the family by going with this penniless person and to go live together in sin in the city.
Right.
Like,
well,
it's like a really big threat in the third act.
This is something that I find really interesting about modern day Pride and Prejudice adaptations is how they handle Lydia Bennet.
Yeah.
Because Lydia Bennet is a 15, 16-year-old girl
in the
who
books,
commits the crime of liking boys too much.
Well, and also falling for an older man who takes advantage of her, basically.
Exactly. So I've seen a few modern Pride and Prejudice adaptations. The one that lingers the most in my mind is the Lizzie Bennet Diaries.
Yeah.
The YouTube series. And that one, Lydia Bennet is 21 years old, and they show the Wickham and Lydia relationship to be an abusive one, like an emotionally abusive one. And then he threatens to publish their sex tape on the internet.
But I feel like that is a similar
it's about shame.
A similar level of shame as to sort of the shame that Lydia was bringing upon the family by running off with him in the movie or in the book, compared to in a modern adaptation, what happens. And there's no
I mean, a big struggle of all the adaptations has been to try and construct scenarios that have a similar level of social expectation to the Regency era, which there's nothing like that today. There's yes, high school has a lot of expectations associated with it and social rules that you're meant to understand without them ever being spoken, and things that get, that if you transgress them, you'll be bullied and ostracized. And yet it doesn't come close to the kind of ostracizing that, would take place in this era. So, it always sort of involves a level of exaggeration or comedic inflation of, what are today basically just social expectations and rules.
In the book, I'm pretty sure the Bennets are considering moving out of the neighborhood to escape the shame of having a daughter live in sin with a man.
And also ruining the prospects of the other sisters as well. Whereas that's the sins of the one does not equal the sins of the others in today's society usually.
Right. Well, I mean, again, it's you can inflate it for dramatic effect. You can say, oh man, if people think my sister is a slut, then they're gonna think we're all sluts. But you're obviously going to be playing up a high school sort of childish expectation, which I think is interesting because it almost makes sense to frame that era and its extreme social rules as being somewhat childish and ridiculous.
Absolutely.
But you need it for the story to work if you're going to be in any way faithful as an adaptation.
Well, what's really interesting is, so Lizzie Bennet and Mr. Darcy are the same class. They're, despite the fact that they have very different amounts of money, they are both landed gentry. Mr. Bennet is a landlord, and so is Mr. Darcy. So they're both landlords. So that's part of basically the comedy of Lady Catherine de Bourgh coming to be how dare you be engaged to Mr. Darcy? You are nothing, you're nothing compared to my family, when that's not true. They're the same class, and that's what's important, essentially.
I mean, yes, but like it's interesting because in Emma, you know, like there's like the widow, or not the widow, like Mrs. Bates and Miss Bates, who and she's sort of like a spinster character who never married, and so, you know, basically her class is lowering because she couldn't get married and because she no longer is technically part of the landed gentry, even though she grew up the daughter of a lord. So it's like, you know, like wealth does play a factor into it, certainly, but it's just not the only factor. It's like it's right. It's weirdly intersectional.
Well, Miss Bates and Emma are essentially in the same situation, but Miss Bates is poor and Emma is wealthy and has her own wealth. So she never has to worry about getting married, which is why she's always marrying everyone else off.
Right. Yeah. Which is, you know, translated in, you know, the modern adaptation Clueless as, well, Alicia Silverstone, her dad is rich. She's never going to have to work in her life, probably, but she's still in high school is like the main reason that she's not thinking about marriage. And she's pairing people up sort of more as just like typical high school, like flirty liking to you know, to match people up with other people. And it always serves her interests.
Right. Well, and I mean, I think that I honestly think that the most faithful modern adaptation of all of these is Clueless to Emma, versus like, you know, Pride and Prejudice to Bridget Jones, or Sense and Sensibility to Prada de Nada, which I promise we'll talk about. It's a weird movie. We'll talk about it. But in Clueless, you know, she wants to kind of do good and like help, but like is just so privileged that she's never had to actually think about what doing good actually looks like, you know? And so in her mind, it's adopting the poor new girl who just like needs a makeover and making her better. And like it's fascinating to me how much of a like exact character like basis that is on Emma from the movies and the original novels. Just because it's very different from a lot of other Austen protagonists. Like she's rich, she's like smart but not very like witty, you know, like she's kind of mean, whereas like the sweetness or like affability of a lot of the other protagonists is like usually like a big draw to them. And so it's, I don't know, it's just very interesting watching her grow and watching her take like, oh, this is what it means to do a good deed, and like realize that it's not what she means at all, you know?
Yeah.
I also found the Harriet Smith to Ty comparison to be really interesting, because Harriet Smith's whole thing is about no one knows who her parents are. So, but Emma likes her as a person, so she's like, oh, she must actually be from a wealthy landed gentry family. And how her kind of like puffing Harriet up leads her to Harriet, instead of, you know, accepting Mr. Martin's proposal, who is a farmer.
And like the person she actually likes.
Is suddenly like, I love Mr. Knightley, who's like the top of the like
the social ladder.
The social ladder. And Emma's like horrified because,
but I think she's less horrified because by that time it's that she's realized that she in fact like loves him, and it's more like, I'm responsible for her like thinking this, but also I'm upset because I love him and want to marry him. But you know, like that sort of drama and conflict, which is very
and that's why I think Clueless works so well as a movie,
Right.
because then you have Cher and Ty, and Ty suddenly becomes more popular than Cher, which sends her into a tailspin. And then she's like, oh, I like Josh. And then Cher's like, oh, no, I like Josh.
So this is what I will say. Usually, like, you know, it's more cringe in the original like telling, where it's like, oh, that's a 16-year-old marrying a 45-year-old. Weird, uncomfortable. But it's actually, I would say, the Clueless that's more uncomfortable, with like her basically marrying her stepbrother.
It's like they made the relationship even closer than what it was in the original novel.
He could have just been like a neighbor, you know? Right. But like,
or she could have had a sister and he was her sister husband's brother.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that's a very common thing.
Yes.
To like know your extended family.
Right.
And then they were like,
but they're
ex-stepbrother. That's what we're gonna do. And because he's played by Paul Rudd, you just can't help it. You're still gonna fall in love with him.
Paul Rudd is great in that movie. I will say though, I'd seen Clueless before, and watching Emma, I was like, I think I watched the like 1990
the Gwyneth Paltrow version.
One. Yeah, which I did like better than the 2021. But the guy in that who plays Mr. Knightley looks basically like Paul Rudd. Like, I was like, is that Paul Rudd? No, wait. No, he's British. This is not Paul Rudd.
Well, it's not a crazy expectation, because, you know, it was Bridget Jones that first introduced the idea of taking actors from the BBC adaptations, and then just sort of plopping them in as a way to sort of make it feel even more British, even more Austen. So Hugh Grant, who had been in
really
Sensibility, and of course Mark Darcy being played by Mr. Darcy actor Colin Firth from the BBC series.
So I think the timeline is Bridget Jones's Diary is published, then the 1995 Pride and Prejudice is published, and then Bridget Jones' The Edge of Reason is published, and she puts in there Bridget Jones being obsessed with the scene where Colin Firth jumps into the lake, and she like watches it over and over, and they actually, I think they filmed like a special scene where Renee Zellweger interviews Colin Firth in the guise of Bridget Jones.
Right.
And then they were like, they're making the movie, and they're like, you know, it'd be funny having Colin Firth play Mark Darcy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all of these adaptations, the modernized adaptations, they're very focused on costume and dress. The makeover is very central to them. So I'm curious, you know, in terms of the pros, what would you say is Jane Austen's treatment of dress, of costume, I suppose?
I noticed that too, and I found it really interesting that the whole idea of like, there really isn't makeovers in Jane Austen, but there is.
But what about just describing people's dresses as a way of sort of conveying class or something like that?
Honestly, I don't remember anything like that from the books. Like, she doesn't spend all much time describing people's clothes.
I think it's interesting, because I think you're onto something where, you know, in the, you know, original telling of the tales, when they're set in the Regency area, you know, obviously in those shows it's about, you know, we as viewers get joy from seeing everyone all dressed up in the clothing of the era, but, you know, no one gets like, a clothing makeover or like their hair done differently. You know, it's more of like a like societal makeover, you know, where it's like, oh, I must teach you how to act, and that is the form that a makeover
Right. But
takes.
film, of course, is a visual medium,
Right.
whereas the novel traditionally is epistolary.
Mhm.
You know, it doesn't even really describe the scenes. It tells the story through letters or through a diary or something like that. So in a visual medium, you can convey the story through costume. You can convey the story through,
Right.
you know, a change of clothing, where Renee Zellweger is going to, you know, try on a bunch of different outfits and then get soaked in rain, or is going to, you know, comment on Mark Darcy's, you know, weird, ugly Christmas sweater.
But then end up wearing her own in
Right.
the sequels and whatnot.
Yeah.
I did find it really interesting how, especially in Clueless, where because Emma's is trying to make Harry a more high class, but her main goal is matchmaking and trying to pair up people and help them find love. But in Clueless, that mainly translates into changing entire outfit and her clothes and her hair, and then with the female teacher too, where they're like, oh, take your glasses off,
right,
and, oh, your hair is
this
really
way,
pretty. And
right.
like,
It speaks to a new kind of hierarchy that, like, of course the hierarchy of beauty existed in that time, but with the removal of the idea of like class and family, like it means that these other things have so much more value now, to how we decide whether someone is, you know, out of someone's league, which is the closest thing we have to like marrying down, I suppose, is like,
right. Well, I mean, you know, like there definitely are social classes, you know, like someone who grows up in a mansion marrying someone from a trailer park is definitely going to cause like a stir in some way, but it's not like the social death that it would be, you know, in the Regency era.
right. I had another question, sort of centered on Bridget Jones. Is this work a post-feminist work, is the question. And does it have to be, because it is so obsessed with values that are almost, you could almost say pre-feminism, but you know, obviously they're existing in a context of you know, women's issues, but they're sort of pre, you know, our modern conception of the, you know, the 20th century women's rights movement. So is Bridget Jones post-feminist? Does it have to be post-feminist?
Is it post-feminist? No. Does it have to be? No.
Well, okay, but when I say post-feminist, you know, I want to make sure, you know, I'm being clear. It's a story about, you know, a character who her vision of success is defined almost entirely through, you know, through capitalism, through, you know, through her success under capitalism, and through her ability to secure a man of status to have a child with, to be married, have 2.5 kids, live in a big house, whatever. These are values that are typical, and the way that she attains it, it's entirely within her control, her choice, sort of thing. That's the way that the story is portrayed. It's not necessarily portrayed that society is conditioning her into particular roles. She is responsible for the choices that she makes, and she has several getting her ass in gear montages where she takes responsibility for things like her weight, her cleanliness habits, all these self-care sort of things that are in the way of her achieving happiness in the ways I previously defined.
Right, but like how does that feel post-feminist to you?
So what post-feminism is, I'm defining it, it's a sort of aesthetic presentation of a womanhood that that is grateful for all of the progress that feminism has brought, but that sort of doesn't need the movement as it stands, that they've sort of reached a point where the rest is up to you, sort of thing. It's it's an aesthetic or a philosophy that is associated with like you know girl boss type of marketing.
Right.
So, in my opinion, I think the fact that Bridget Jones is set in the early 90s is important. If the 90s were anything like how the movie portrays it, then they were just a hellscape.
Which they were, and that was the birth of post-feminism was the 90s, and it was the you can have it all, you know, having it all as a concept evolving in that period of time, and it sort of ended the sort of radical aspects of feminism that were so important to the 70s and 80s.
Sure.
I don't think that, if I'm understanding you correctly, I don't think that Bridget Jones in any way, I think the idea that Bridget can have it all is like almost impossible, just because, like, you know, she's a person in her 30s who drinks too much. What do they say? Drinks like a fish, smokes like a chimney, and dresses like her mother, or something like that. And it was just an awkward person who doesn't always make the best decisions. And I just think the era that it's set in is just really important, because I don't exactly think Helen Fielding was setting out to like write anything specifically post-feminist.
Right. Like I think there's a lot of you know, there's still a lot of reliance on, like, she's definitely still feeling the pressures of society in the story. You know, like she goes to the couples dinner and they're like, why are all these women single? And she's like,
right, but I don't think it's ever really questioned as like an ultimate end goal. There's not like a character in the story who represents like a, you know, a fully, you know, liberated woman, not bound by the conventions of, you know, social expectation.
Yeah, but I would think that you could argue that her eventually rejecting Daniel could be seen as a sign of liberation, because like she thinks essentially that Daniel is what the best she can get, even though he's horrible to her, cheats on her, blows her off,
just like
all
a
that stuff.
Sexist, harassing asshole.
I know. The whole I watching the emailing part in 2021 is quite an experience.
Yeah, it's pretty cringe.
Well, so that's the sort of the exact thing that I'm you know, I'm pointing to as this, as an example of, you know, an ideology that is sometimes implicit, sometimes not, you know, something that the author would have in particular subscribed to, you know, but that it's a sort of, you know, it's a sentiment that sort of permeates a lot of popular media and a lot of marketing of, you know, stories that focus on a woman making choices, but those choices are completely, you know, her own. She's isolated, independent, whatever. There's no use for a kind of political feminism, a political movement of feminism to any of her problems. She is making choices, right? She's saying, and okay, I'm choosing to be objectified in my workplace by my boss because I am into it.
Right.
And then when that becomes, you know, when she has a realization that that's not what she wants, she simply makes a decision to be with a better guy, as opposed to the inherent misogyny in the capitalist system, which is never really critiqued because there's a really nice guy right over there. That's sort of my take on how I read Bridget Jones as post-feminist. But it's fine if you guys don't agree. That's just that's my reading.
I think you're not wrong to see that. Like I don't know. I didn't particularly, and maybe it's because it is post-feminist. Like I didn't particularly look at it and go, feminism the movie, you know, like I
Right.
think you're right in that, you know, like it's definitely a product of the 90s. It's definitely a rom-com.
So you would read it more as that than as a direct consequence of the source material being that like,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
okay, so that's interesting to me, you know. So it's like we could imagine, I suppose, like an adaptation of a Jane Austen novel that isn't focused on, you know, individual decisions and choices of the protagonists, and that doesn't really ever try to break or shatter the social bonds that are controlling all of the women in the story.
Wait, you're saying that one can imagine that, or they can't?
I'm asked if you're saying that there could be a more feminist, I suppose,
Yeah.
adaptation set in the modern day,
Yeah.
but that tells the story of one of Jane Austen's many novels, but
Mhm.
that doesn't rely on remaining within a socially confined, you know,
Right.
path for women, and that doesn't center on women's individual choices as opposed to a more broad, you know, political opposition or a radical
Right.
take on society in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely possible.
Okay. Yeah. But I feel like I
think,
see in these three films, even in Prada, which maybe we can move on to
yes, let's
next.
finally talk about the worst movie that we watched.
But just sort of a centering of things on, like, you know, we've solved all the problems of feminism. All that's left is for women to make the right choices, is sort of the reading that one could get from several of these things. So let's talk about the story of Prada and its relationship to Sense and Sensibilities.
Yeah, so in Prada, starring Alexa Vega from Spy Kids.
He was the best one in this movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And also Wilmer Valderrama, canceled guy from that 70s show.
Yes.
So odd stars for
Yeah.
this one.
Yeah. So it was a very strange movie. What was it? Like 2012, like 2000.
It was definitely the newest.
Yeah.
I saw a lot of Clueless influence in it, but they didn't do it as well.
No.
Like the dead mother portrait.
Right. It was very, very weird. Like, so they definitely made a lot of changes in Prada from like the
Right.
original
They mainly
story.
kept the premise, which is it's about moving from higher class to lower class,
Right.
but still maintaining that sort of inherited, like, born with a spoon in, you know, silver spoon in your mouth kind of wealth,
Right.
or class, just like inherent class
Yeah.
outside of wealth. But does that even exist anymore in American society?
I mean, yeah.
Like, I mean, if you don't have the money, like, you can't mix in those same circles. Like,
right, exactly.
It's just not done.
So, you know, it's interesting, like her, so these two girls, their father passes away and he's got some weird will that gives it to like this brother that they didn't know about.
He's broke.
Oh, that's right. He's also broke. So it's like it doesn't even matter about the will.
Again,
so they're just
again,
like,
it's like we don't have this anymore. We don't have that women can't inherit land and wealth.
And
we've moved past
girlfriend, wife.
Yeah,
I couldn't understand. I couldn't if they were married or not.
Yeah,
but they're house flippers.
Yes.
So they buy the house and start to renovate it.
Yeah,
essentially.
You know, and sort of like drive them from the house, and they go to stay with some relatives who live in you know, LA proper in you know, a Hispanic Mexican neighborhood, and so, you know, they have to adjust to working and, you know, actually having to struggle for once in their lives. And,
also, they have to adjust to being negged by their love interests, particularly the Colonel Brandon character, which I did not understand at all.
Yeah, he was like, "You idiot, you don't know how to do anything. Let me show you how to do stuff." And she's like, "Ew, no." And then she's like, "Actually, I love you." Like that's the character arc.
Right. Well, I think it's sort of, that almost feels more inspired by Pride and Prejudice than Sense and Sensibility, where, in Pride and Prejudice,
Yeah, I
even the
could see
original,
that
there's
argument.
more banter
Mhm.
between, Lizzie and Darcy.
Darcy, right.
So it feels like, a sort of more general Austen-y kind of delivery
Mhm.
where, yes, they neg each other repeatedly,
Right.
and it's also like a class-based thing where
Yeah.
it's not that he's old that makes Wilmer Valderrama the weirdo.
Right.
It's that he's poor, he's
Right.
low class, he's like a mechanic / artist / handyman, gardener man. He's everything.
He's a Renaissance poor.
He's a Renaissance poor, which should be a TV trope page
we
if it doesn't exist.
We should talk about that one next.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's weird the way that Sense and Sensibility gets kind of mixed up with Pride and Prejudice, which I think tends to be the more popular Austen anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're gonna ask like the man on the street, name a Jane Austen novel, they're gonna say Pride and Prejudice.
You on the street, tell me a Jane Austen novel.
Quick,
Duh, I
for
don't
$1.
know, Pride and
Name a
Prejudice,
Jane Austen
whatever.
novel.
Yes, for $1.
So the Colonel Brandon character and the Willoughby character.
Mhm.
So the Colonel, I can't remember any of their names, so I'm just referring to them by their original names. He negs Marianne, and then that's apparently true romance. Whereas the Willoughby character, reads poetry to her,
and that's romance.
But that's not real romance because he was a scum all along.
Right.
He was married and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I feel like the movie had a lot of opinions about things, and then they didn't really follow through to the ends.
Right, and the Marianne character does still like poetry in Prada Donata, but she is more defined by her naivete in the sense that she's classist and that she has prejudice against people who she sees below her, which is portrayed as naive. But that's certainly not Marianne's issue, who would, certainly if she hadn't, needed the money, would be happy to, marry beneath her standing for love, true love, poetic, Shakespearean, whatever kind of love.
Right.
So it's a very different sort of vibe character-wise.
Absolutely. And then I think the Eleanor character,
who's a career woman.
Right. Which is a very interesting, I don't know. I feel like it's an interesting change from, being oh, I love this person, but he couldn't possibly love me back, to being I can't allow myself to love. I'm not allowed to have feelings.
Which is a much more modern sort of sensibility. Yeah.
The social, instead of the social forces forcing them apart, and such as I've got a 5-year plan.
Right.
And I can't possibly let anyone think that I slept my way to the top or anything like that.
Yeah.
Also,
I think in some ways it works. I think, Prada Donata is not a great film, but I think it shows all of the work that you have to do to make an adaptation of Austen work in modern day, because our values are just so radically different. So you're really, just taking the sort of characters that are used in Austen to critique that previous, novels of sensibility, novels of sentimentality, and you're using them to critique Hollywood narratives instead. And that's what they're for.
I totally agree, which is why I found the ending so odd. Especially for Eleanor and her love interest, because they've been doing a very modern day take on it. And then at the end, he's I've bought you a house. Will you marry me? Right. And then he actually says the line from Sense and Sensibility, which is, my heart has always been and always will be yours. And I was like, whoa, guys, slow down. You have kissed once.
Right.
Right.
Whereas I mean, like Mark Darcy, when he proposes first, or he professes his love, I guess, first to Bridget, uh, he does not like insult her class and whatever else when he's saying like that I like you, that I have feelings for you. So there's more of a change there almost in like that confession, proposal, whatever kind of scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, because in the original, Darcy's like, your family sucks. You're poor.
But I love you anyway.
It freaks me out
Right.
that I love you so much. Will you marry me?
And she's like, no, this is the shittiest proposal I've ever heard.
Right. Yeah, so that's what I mean of the kind of Austen character who's, they're there to critique those expectations.
Right. Like they're
not
very
necessarily to
trope.
shatter them, but to show that, yeah, not everyone was as on board with these things as Pamela or, some of the other early novel
Right.
heroines.
Going back to what you said about post-feminism, in these characters in the Jane Austen novels, the main thing that traps them is societal expectations.
Mhm.
Women can't
Do this
make
and don't
money.
do
They
that.
can't own land.
Mhm.
The literally only way they can move up in the world is by getting married.
Mhm.
So that's
Right.
why I think it would be somewhat difficult to make a modern day adaptation where your characters are deliberately breaking down those sort of
Right.
walls.
I
They're not
think
taking
that's
down
one of the sort
those
of traps of
barriers.
adaptation is yeah, we like seeing Jane Austen over and over again, mostly set in the time period where it takes place, because there's a kind of wish fulfillment, isn't there, in boiling down the human experience to these extremely rigid social roles.
Right.
That the wish fulfillment of being like whisked away by like a magical prince, like
Mhm.
even fairy tales, like prince literature has that
Mhm.
same kind of wish fulfillment aspect to it. Who is Mr. Darcy but
Right.
a sort of Shrek like figure who he's disgusting
Oh
on a
my
moral level, but
God.
eventually you fall in love with him.
Someone please Photoshop like Colin Firth's face onto Shrek. Like, please, please.
Well, I think you can really trace. This is going back to Pride and Prejudice, but I think you can really trace through time the different ways that Lydia Bennett's story is treated. So in like the 1944 version,
Mhm.
she's just kind of like ditzy because it's supposed to be like the
Flappers.
1940 Girl Friday kind
Right.
of movies. And they're like, oh, I'm married now.
Right.
In the 1995, I think she has more depth. And she's just kind of portrayed as like a 16-year-old who's laser focused on boys and getting married.
Right.
And then in the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice, which I have opinions about, they had this really weird part where they imply that Wickham is going to be a physically abusive husband. And then if you go through the modern ones, there's all these, like in Bride and Prejudice, which is the Bollywood one.
Okay.
I believe she's rescued and then she becomes a motivational speaker.
Okay.
This is just an aside. Sorry, if Bride and Prejudice, isn't it actually like not real Bollywood? Like it's the director of Bend It Like Beckham.
That's a bad way to describe it. It's like it's been so many years since I've seen.
But it's a British film, but the director of Bend It Like Beckham has that kind of sensibility.
Yeah. So yeah, it's not an actual Bollywood film.
Okay.
But it's got a lot of those vibes.
Yeah.
And in Lizzie Bennet Diaries, she like becomes more self-sufficient and like has more of a, she can like do things on her own and not do anything like that. So I don't really know where I'm going with this point, but
you were saying that like things can sort of be tracked, you know, adaptation wise by specifically looking at the character of Lydia Bennet and like how her storyline is
society
adapted.
kind of views Lydia Bennet's story.
Like what does it mean to be a disgraced woman or to be you know, make poor choices regarding love in different modern contexts.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I kind of want to talk about like the tropes that these characters tend to typify, you know.
Sure.
So I think in these stories, we've said it several times, it's about dealing with the pressures of society and how these characters sort of react. But I think there's also, you know, like these are very tropish characters.
Right.
Like, you know, there's always like the handsome rogue who rides into town and causes trouble and misleads someone and breaks their heart. There's, you know, the noble gentleman who's maybe a little standoffish at first, but eventually confesses his true feelings.
Right. I think the older lady characters are especially tropish and they follow these same patterns in all of the books. You have, you know, at least one like legit spinster who's like, you know, never really settled down for whatever reason. You have, you know, unhappy married couples, you know, where the wife is, you know, overly obsessed with some social rule and the husband is, you know,
totally disengaged.
Right. I got to sit here and read my paper or work on my fishing or sit in a boat, you know, those kind of things.
Yeah. You know, so you definitely have that. There's usually a hysterical parent in some respect, whether it's a father or a mother. You also get a lot of dead parents depending on the adaptation or the specific story you're reading. For like the leads themselves, you know, you get a lot of quirky girls, I would say, you know,
highly educated, obsessed with, you know, the arts, poetry, literature.
Very sensible, usually in some way,
or quite the opposite, naive and idealistic. So there's always contrasts in that.
Yes, like there, especially if there's sisters and siblings, you know, the siblings always contrast very much with each other, even the ones who get along, you know, like in Pride and Prejudice, there's Lizzie and Jane who get along very, very well, but, you know, Jane is the beautiful, reserved one, and, you know, Elizabeth is more of the outgoing, sort of witty, bantery, smart one, etc.
It seemed like in several of the adaptations there was a plot point of someone being sort of afraid to show their affections for whatever reason, which leads to misunderstandings and people saying, you know, don't marry that person, she doesn't really love you, and then her being like, I did love you, I just couldn't show it for reasons.
Right. For complicated, contrived societal reasons.
So, I mean, it becomes even more just like arbitrary misunderstandings in the modern adaptations, but definitely, you know, still misunderstandings in the originals, but they're usually based around some kind of social convention that is being criticized.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of the, you know, if you wanted to boil Austen down to just like some of its core ingredients, you would get a lot of Darcy grime along the edges.
And Liz, I think your observation about the sort of like His Girl Friday, Hepburn sort of like dynamic of these characters, like the dialogue is like a huge appeal of Austen, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons why Jane Austen is adapted to the screen so much is because her dialogue is so good.
And
To
why
the
her
point
fans
where
are so
actually-
proprietary about changing any of the dialogue for to fit a
Actually-
Hollywood screenplay.
So if you were to compare the 1940 Pride and Prejudice, the 1995, and the Keira Knightley one, most of those lines, at least in the first two, are just taken straight from the book.
Of course.
Even if they take different ones, it's actually really interesting to compare which ones
they choose to take.
And sometimes I think reading Jane Austen can be a little dry because I think her words are best spoken out loud.
It's like Shakespeare,
Yeah,
it was almost meant to be performed.
exactly.
Yeah. They were novels meant to be declaimed,
Yeah, I think, as far as the dialogue, it's very much in that bantery style, and it's strictly humorous. And so that's why I think it becomes like more rom-coms today, even though like the focus of Austen was on drama and truth and reality rather than on trying to make you laugh. But the dialogue, I think, is what persists through adaptation.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with Pride and Prejudice, which is, I think, her funniest book. Maybe with Emma being second in terms of funniest.
Yeah.
Whereas like Sensibility and Persuasion and the others are not sad, but not as like
they're not as banter filled.
Yeah, not as banter filled. Listen.
So if I were to argue that the screwball comedy can trace its roots back to Jane Austen, which I'm not necessarily making that argument, but if you wanted to, you would basically say, all right, Austen's novels are comedies of marriage with happy endings where people get together with the person they're supposed to be with. And then screwball comedies are traditionally thought of as comedies of remarriage because they take place in a different social, constructed world where people were getting divorced or leaving each other and then getting back together. And that's a happy ending in the world of the 40s and screwball comedies. And then screwball comedies eventually lead to modern day romantic comedies, the Meg Ryans of the 90s and, and so on. And it all retains that root of women who are initially sort of putting off their, their complicated romantic interests and saying, oh, we're not really into each other. And then eventually they are, and they get together and it's great.
There you go. I think you summed it up.
What do you think of my theory that Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy created the enemies
to lovers
trope?
I mean, I don't know about created, but certainly typify. It's very enemies to lovers, which I think that's it's just another one of these juicy tropes that Austen employs that people latch onto.
And I think the realism of their initial, disattraction or unattraction to each other, the way that is portrayed was so true to life, so real, that I think it has resonations. It resonates throughout history and through the screwball comedy and through to the modern, YA drama or your average, AO3 post.
But I mean, Meg Ryan, half of those movies are also like enemies to lovers,
You could make the argument that You Got Mail is like a Pride and Prejudice adaptation.
Honestly, you really could.
Right, which is why I'm sure, if anybody, is thinking, well, you left out this adaptation or that adaptation, we probably did because we went with specifically the three that they say in the title or in the credits adapted from this Jane Austen novel. I think that there was another one for Sense and Sensibility called
Material Girls.
If anyone has seen that, feel free to tweet at us at Talking Tropes with your take on that.
Liz's
it's a Hilary Duff and then her sister also movie.
Haley Duff, right?
Hilary and Haley Duff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Listen.
I think that one you said basically it's just the same premise as Prada to Nada.
No,
it's not.
You
In
said
the slide, is I don't know how they are legally allowed to call it a Sense and Sensibility adaptation.
But
because they have
they're
these
wealthy
girls,
and then they lose their wealth and have
yeah, they
to
lose their
learn to
wealth,
cope
but they
with-
spend the whole story trying to get their house back, and then they get it back, and
that's it.
that's it. Like,
So it's just like the basic premise of losing your wealth.
Right. That's what I mean, is that it just shares the same initial sort of inciting incident and
Right.
action, and then the rest of it is more Hollywood Hillary Duffness and Madonna also is in there somehow.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, so please let us know what your favorite Austen adaptation is, whether it's, you know, a Regency era period piece or if it's Clueless, you know.
be brave enough to talk about why the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice isn't a good Pride and Prejudice adaptation.
Liz, I don't know why you
It's a
think
fine
this is a
film,
hot
though.
take. Most people I have talked to don't like it as much as the 1995
you must
version.
not on being on the Austen internet nearly as much.
Oops, I guess not.
Listen, I'm just gonna say the director does not understand the tone of Pride and Prejudice. This is my truth. I must speak it out into the world, and he does not understand the wealth of the Bennets at all. He just doesn't get it.
Doesn't get it.
Who reads Pride and Prejudice and thinks, yes, romantic drama. This is what we're gonna do. Rain, torrential thunderstorm during a proposal scene.
Yeah,
Who thinks that?
There's a lot of rain in that movie.
There's so much rain. Oh my god. I'm
Well,
sorry.
it did come
I just had to
after
speak my
Bridget
my
Jones,
truth.
so maybe that's why.
Yeah, but please tweet us your favorite Austen adaptation at Talking Tropes. I'm Hannah. He's David, and thank you so much, Liz, for joining us and being here and lending us your expertise and your Austen love. It's
Thank
been
you.
a pleasure having you.
It was a
Is there
pleasure
anything you
being
want to
here.
Is there anything you want to plug or, you know, promote or anything?
You can follow me on Twitter at Liz DeKok, LIZDEKOK. Otherwise,
That's it.
you know, that's it really.
She
All
makes
right.
great tweets. Can confirm.
Well, you can catch us next week. We'll have another Standing Stanley Tucci for y'all. And we'll see y'all later.
Bye.